All right, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another Serious Angler podcast. As always, I am your host, Bailey Egbrett, and joined with me is my co-host, the captain, Mr. Andrew Full. And tonight is episode 224 with Mr. Gene Gilliland from Bass. Obviously, we're going to get on and talk about a whole bunch of amazing stuff that Andrew and I have been beyond excited to talk about for a very long time. And obviously, we'll get into that here in a little bit. But Andrew, long day getting ready for ICAST. Obviously, today's show is on a Friday. As we speak right now, I'm probably on a plane to Orlando. Got a cool little event this weekend, and obviously ICAST coming up next week. But, dude, it was one of those days where I'm just like, tonight I'm, my mind just might blank out. So
fair enough.
Don't freak out if I'm just like ghostly staring into the screen.
Yeah, I've had one of those days as well, so I feel your pain. And then we have some other stuff going on too in the background on top of some of the stuff I was telling you about. It's just mush. So it's been a rough day.
Well, I would like to take a chance to humble brag in the fact that I understand we both had mentally grueling days, but I am at least glad I'm on the side where I love what I do so far. And I'm excited for you in the future to transition into doing what you love to do. So.
Yeah. Unofficially, the countdown is at like 45 days, I think. It's either 45 or 48 days, unofficially official.
Have you told the folks yet, like, your official plan?
No, and part of me is thinking about doing it sooner after today. So, it was one of those days.
Dang,
one of those days.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. No worries. I mean, the sooner you're doing your own thing, the sooner you are into greener pastures and the happier person you'll be. And I just can't wait to jack fish all the time. So,
yeah, dude.
So
for folks really fast, before obviously we get Gene here on the show, yesterday we posted the winners for the AFTCO Power and Amped Outdoors giveaway. And obviously we announced the new giveaway this week that will obviously run until next Thursday. And that is with Hobie Eyewear and Lure Lock. So you guys can head over to our Instagram page and get all signed up and entered for that. Super easy. Just follow the pages, like the post. And
is that one winner, or is it one winner for each package?
One winner for both.
Awesome.
And we're giving one winner each week. And then we got some pretty cool stuff to wrap up the last week of giveaways for the month of July. But we got some crazy stuff coming up. One thing I mentioned to people in the post this week on Instagram was how you and I have been having a hectic couple weeks of work. And our sincere apologies to the folks of not having some fishing videos throughout the week.
Oh, we have them on backlog. It's just
we have like 7 to 10 videos right now that we can get out for you guys. It just need to be edited, and Andy and I just need, exactly like Andy right now, taking a cat nap while I'm talking. We're gonna basically all we have to do is edit it and then get it out. And once we get a gap come this fall, we're gonna be starting pumping out a lot of videos. It's just work's been crazy for both of us. But we look forward to obviously getting those out for you guys, and look forward to accumulating more, because after ICAST, I get home on that Friday night, literally at like midnight. I don't know if I'm going to film the Open or not. I don't know how much of practice I'll film, but I literally that night get back at midnight, pack up my car, and then drive to Oneida like 6 hours later to meet up for Oneida. And then basically I'm there from Saturday to Friday. So after day 2 of the Open, basically I turn around and drive and meet you at Sodas for 2 days for a 2-day tournament out there. So come Friday, I won't be home for like 2.5 weeks.
Dude, I feel your pain, right? So like I'm working this full-time thing, the podcast, obviously, trying to edit video. I have a 2-year-old daughter. I figured it out. I'm going to be in Rochester every weekend until the end of August. Like,
oh man.
Yeah, because this weekend I have the Dash for Cash with Brad. So I'm practicing Saturday. I have a family party Saturday night, tournament Sunday. Work all week. Go back to Rochester. It's my daughter's 2-year-old birthday. The following weekend, Sodas. The weekend after that, I feel like I have a tournament somewhere. Like, it's just like, oh.
I think we do at Lower Niagara or something like that.
No, it's not Lower Niagara. It's August 7th, 8th. There's something going on. It's mine and my wife's anniversary. That's what's going on August 7th and 8th. Weekend after that is my father-in-law's 70th birthday. You're moving to Buffalo that weekend. Like, oh God, it never ends. And then I go to the Thousand Islands for a week after that. Like,
oh man. Well, folks, you can obviously see there's a lot of stuff coming down the pipe. But
yeah.
I think, Andrew, without further ado, we shouldn't make it wait any longer.
Yeah.
Let's get Gene on the show and let's start talking fishing. Gene, what is going on, man?
Good evening.
Just glad to be here with y'all. I'm in Potsdam, New York, waiting for the kickoff of the St. Lawrence River Elite Bassmaster Elite Tournament that starts tomorrow morning at 7:00. And we'll be, we just got back from several days at Lake Champlain.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got to hear the last tournament of the season coming up here this next 4 days.
Is it kind of bittersweet to be at the end of 2021?
No.
Fair enough.
You're asking him at the end of a 2-week grinder when he's up in New York away from home.
Well, what's really odd is that the season's gonna be over in the middle of July. And that's what, last year we went into November because of COVID and delays and all that. So this year is just seems very compressed. And getting over in July. Normal year, sometimes we're into August or September before we have these end of the year tournaments. But this year, we went from a super long stretched out season last year to a very compressed one this year. And so now we've got, for the elites tournament series,
right?
We've got basically now until next February. Now, certainly the Opens, the Bass Nation, the high school, college, there's a lot of tournaments that BASS is running that go all the way into December. But this is the end of the Elite Series.
It's going to feel like forever probably for next year to start up for you.
Yeah, it will. Well, except that I wind up going to a lot of those other trails.
Oh, okay.
Circuits. One of my jobs as conservation director is to work with our crew and our staff at all the different types of events. And I don't go to every tournament. We 40 some odd tournaments that Bass runs over the course of the season. But I will wind up going to some of the elites, some of the opens. We've got the high school championship is coming up the week after ICAST. The college championship will be back here in Waddington in August. And so then I've got a Bass Nation National Championship to go to. So my season gets stretched out pretty much over the whole year. It's just I don't go to all of any one of those circuits. I luckily for me, I get to kind of pick and choose which ones that I go to.
Right. And now, so you mentioned obviously that you're the conservation director for Bass, and excuse me for not starting with this question, but for folks who may not know your role, know a little bit about you, really fast, tell folks that might be listening, tuning into this, obviously who you are, and obviously your background and kind of how you got started in your role with Bass.
Well, my background is a fishery biologist. I got my degrees in fisheries from Texas A&M, then Oklahoma State. Then I got a job with the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation, and I worked there as a research biologist and eventually as an administrator for 32 years. And I retired from the state 7 years ago and took the job as conservation director with Bass. I had worked with Bass over the past 25 plus years on fish care issues and bass biology. I wrote a column for Bass Times magazine for almost 20 years. So I've been involved with the company for much longer than I've actually been employed by them. But taking the job as the conservation director, I have three main roles. One of them, as I mentioned, was working with our tournament staff across the country on tournaments, dealing with fish care and making sure that as many of the fish that come in go back into the water alive and healthy, and working with the anglers and trying to make sure they're doing everything they can to keep those fish healthy. The other thing that I do is work with the Bass Nation, with our state affiliates. Every state has a state conservation director who is just a volunteer bass angler who has a passion for protecting the resource. Very few of those state conservation directors have much training or background working with state agencies or with government or with politics. So I help them deal with state and local issues, whether it's access or invasive species or fisheries management issues, working with their state. We really try to build good relationships with the state agencies. And then the third part of my job is on a national scale. I represent Bass, the company, and bass anglers on a number of different boards and councils that deal with fisheries policy, oftentimes at the Washington, D.C. level. So it's kind of that three parts of my job that I have to work with. The tournament aspects, as I said, I do get to kind of pick and choose the places that I go. I like to go to the tournaments where, if it's a new place where we haven't been before, a lot of times I work with local media and with the local host to help them understand the fact that we do turn all the fish loose, that we try to release all the bass that we catch, because sometimes they may not understand exactly how that works. I'll go to places where, like up here on the St. Lawrence River, where we're going to have big catches of big fish. And it's always good to have some extra hands on deck to help with the fish care issues that we will run into in a place like this, or at our high school championship at Chickamauga in 3 weeks, where we're going to have 300 boats. So those are the kind of things that, I try to target those on my travel schedule to provide some extra help at those events, to help with the fish care.
Calmality in the chaos.
Right.
If there's such a thing.
Yes, if there is such a thing.
Yeah.
So,
well, Gene, that's kind of one of my first topics I wanted to bring up. Is obviously you're at the St. Lawrence River, where, and correct me if I'm wrong, obviously you've been across the nation much more than I have, but up here in New York this time of year, where these fish are getting off the bed, and in the summer months, especially when you're talking deep smallmouth, is probably one of the more tougher, if not the toughest, places you go as a conservation director in terms of fish mortality, anglers being prepared on the water to obviously keep that resource alive in their live wells throughout the tournament itself, through day 1 to day 4. Is it up here in New York, especially the St. Lawrence River and that type of body of water, the most difficult for you and your job?
Anywhere that we have smallmouth in warmer weather is an issue. Certainly the post-spawn adds another compounding factor to that. Water temperature, in southern lakes, it's all related to water temperature. The whole concept of fish survival, post-tournament survival, is related to water temperature. And so that really makes a big difference. Now with smallmouth, we've got not only temperatures, increasing as we get into summer, long boat rides, rough water, the fact that these guys are having to catch these fish on relatively light lines, so they have to play them down quite a bit. That exhausts those fish. Sometimes it is a deep water situation. So there's a lot of factors that go into what we deal with in northern fisheries And the St. Lawrence is certainly probably the top of the list from the standpoint of so many different factors that we're having to work with, and educate our anglers on what they need to do to make sure that, you know, what they do with those fish in the 5, 6, 7, 8 hours that they're in their live wells is every bit as important as what we do at the weigh-in after we get the fish off the scales and through our weigh-in process and into our live release boats. So it takes both what they do in the boats and what we do at the weigh-in to make sure that those fish go back to the lake as good a condition as possible.
So I guess what my question there would be then to follow up with that is like, what is the perfect recipe for an angler to do to take care of those smallmouth from the moment they catch them to the moment that they're weighed in on stage? Like, what is the perfect recipe to take care of those fish? I guess we could ask.
Yeah, the as I said, temperature control is a big issue, and oxygen is a big issue, and barotrauma relief, or when the fish, their swim bladders swell up and you have to fizz those fish.
Mm-hmm.
So what we recommend for these anglers is to when they put a fish in the live well, if it's one they're going to keep, they need to keep their live wells a little bit cooler. We found that adding ice to the live wells, not a lot, just enough to drop the temperatures about 5 to 7 degrees, can make a significant difference in the health of those fish after they're released. They have to check on those fish very regularly. They can't just put them in the live well, flip a switch, and forget about them until they catch the next fish. They need to really stay on top of that and monitor those fish. If those fish start to show problems, floating on their sides or upside down, showing signs of barotrauma, we want them to fizz those fish in the boat rather than waiting for those to turn them in and let us administer that first aid on the release boat at the end of the tournament. We've seen that if they will do that in the boat within the first 15 to 30 minutes after they see symptoms, it can make a world of difference on how healthy those fish are when we get them finally, when they bring them in to the weigh-in and when we release those fish. Keeping the water fresh, getting a lot of highly oxygenated water into their live wells certainly is, especially if they're making these long runs. That makes all the difference in the world when they get a chance to refresh that. If they've made an hour-long run, to be able to put some fresh water back in there and moderate those temperatures to make sure that those fish stay healthy. We did several years ago up here. We required all of the elite anglers to go through a fizzing training when we brought in Barb Elliott, who is the Bass Nation Conservation Director here in New York. A lot of your viewers probably know Barb.
Mm-hmm.
And we spent 3 days basically training all of the elite anglers on how to fizz their fish. Our release rate went from 92% the year before to 98% the year that we did the fizzing training. And it was very obvious to us on the release boat when those fish came in that year after we had trained everyone. The fish were just in a lot better shape. Their color was good. They were frisky. When we got ready to release those fish, they just shot out of that release boat. And we know it makes a difference. And in fact, not too long ago, Dr. Bruce Tufts from Queen's University in Canada just published a paper looking at the benefits of fizzing. And they found a significant benefit. statistically significant benefit to fizzing those fish. Part of what they compared that to were the little fin clips that a lot of anglers are using now. The fin clips are moderately good first aid, but they don't cure the problem. When those fish blow up, when their swim bladders swell up, the fin clips don't fix that. All the fin clips do is help the fish stay right side up so they don't struggle quite as much. Somebody may not get a dead fish penalty at the end of the day, but it doesn't cure the problem.
It's like a Band-Aid over a flesh wound.
Or fizzing. Fizzing is really the thing that anglers need to learn how to do properly.
Right.
So what we've done again this year is over the last 2 years, we've trained all of the new elite anglers, the ones that didn't go through that process several years ago. Each year we just train the newbies and make sure they're all up to speed on it, and encourage everybody to do that, because it really can make a difference. And there's some really good videos. We shot a couple of videos up here, gosh, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago with Barb Elliott. They're on Bassmaster.com on the conservation video page, that explain the whole process and make it very obvious of why you need to learn how to do that. And it's not just a smallmouth thing. Largemouth need it too, spotted bass. And it's not just a deep water thing. That's one of the things. One of the guys brought in some fish the other day for his training that he caught 8 feet deep. And by the time he brought those fish back to us for his training, they were on their sides and they had swelled up. They needed to be fizzed. And that's one of the common misconceptions that anglers assume, well, if I'm not fishing 20, 30 feet deep, I don't need to worry about it. But that's not true. We've seen that over and over, that it's a stress reaction as much as it is a deep water reaction, and especially with smallmouth. So, to protect these fish, a lot of these fish are 10, 12, 15 years old, those big smallmouth. It's imperative that anglers really do more in the boat and learn how to fizz properly. And by the way, we very much try to teach the fizzing through the side of the fish, not through the mouth. The mouth fizzing has been shown to be more deadly. We actually participated 10 years ago, where we found that fizzing through the mouth can have a significantly higher mortality rate than side fizzing.
Is that because
you find it easier, but the fish bleed to death internally? The way the swim bladder is built, the blood vessels that feed the swim bladder, see if I can, are kind of up at the front of the swim bladder. And if you poke a needle between one of the vessels and get into the swim bladder, you're fine. But if you hit one of those blood vessels, they bleed internally, and you don't know it.
Right.
And those fish get released, and they die 2 or 3 days later. So we have preached against the mouth fizzing now for several years, and that's the side fizzing method has been shown to be much safer, and now based on some of this work that Dr. Tufts has done, we've got some evidence to show how much more effective it is in saving those fish.
All right. So on the topic of fizzing, obviously Andrew and I, being Northerners, were kind of familiar with how to fizz, the topic of fizzing. Are you guys hearing an echo on my end, by chance? Gene, are you hearing an echo?
I'm good.
Okay, I don't hear it as much now. I just wanted to confirm. Okay, so obviously a lot of people attribute fizzing with northern smallmouth, but obviously there are fisheries in the south, especially talking like a TVA fishery, where they say they're on ledges where fizzing is important, but you don't and maybe I'm incorrect here, but you don't hear about a lot of guys fizzing, or they don't know how to fizz being from the South. One, am I incorrect in that? And two, do you think that there's a lot of other fisheries where it's important to fizz, but those fish aren't being fizzed, or there's just not enough education there?
A lot of it is education. But I think there's more of it goes on than what you may hear about. And it's not, like I said earlier, it's not just a largemouth or smallmouth or spotted bass thing. They all can benefit from it. And depending on the situation, it's a matter of anglers learning how to do it. We had some of our guys kind of do a little refresher course prior to our elite tournament on the Tennessee River in Knoxville back in February, just because they were catching fish 20, 30 feet deep. And that's when it kind of comes to mind when people think about, oh, I'm catching these fish in deep water, and they see them floating in the live well. But it can be largemouth, it can be smallmouth, spotted bass. They all can suffer from that same problem. I've worked tournaments where we were fizzing largemouth bass where none of them were caught more than 10 feet deep.
Wow.
So it can be as much a stress reaction as it is just a pressure change from bringing fish up from deep water. I think you hear a little more about it in northern smallmouth fisheries. We hear a lot about it in California. Some of the big spotted bass fisheries places
Right.
out. Some of the lakes out in California, Arizona, Utah. I've worked tournaments out there where we fizzed an awful lot of fish because, unfortunately, the anglers didn't. And that's where you get back to, as you mentioned, the education thing. That's a big part of what we've tried to push with the videos and the training and stuff, and get more of the pro anglers to talk about it and the need for it. And I think as that sort of gains a little bit of traction, the rank and file bass anglers will start to follow. And if they hear Jeff Gustafson, Gussie, talk about the need for fizzing and how important it is, maybe more of them will start paying attention wherever they live, and start taking care of their fish a little better.
Right. Maybe putting a little skit on live as one of the guys is fizzing one of his fish this weekend. Watching him do it and put them in the live well to let them kind of do their thing. That'd be kind of a cool little educational 10-second piece for Bass to do.
Yeah, we actually got a little bit of that on camera from some of the live footage a couple of years ago.
Awesome.
Some of the anglers really took it to heart, and were fizzing. In fact, we've had some of them that when they were catching fish, in one of the years we were up here, they were catching fish really deep, like 40, 50 feet. And by the time they get them to the surface, those fish were just worn out and swollen up like they'd swallowed a golf ball. And even if those were fish that the guy was not going to put in his live well, if they had just released them right away, the fish just floats down the river. So they were having to fizz those fish before they could even release them. And that's what we want them to do. Even if it's one they're culling, we want to make sure that those fish aren't floating down the river with the seagulls pecking on them. We want to make sure that those fish are taken care of, even if it's one that's not going in the live well and ultimately coming into our weigh-in.
Right. Yeah, I've seen some crazy stuff. I haven't spent too much time on the river, but I've been up there a few times to see kind of some crazy stuff. Gene, we talked offline here a little bit about the Bass Nation, the New York event that I was a co-angler for last year. And I had a buddy during practice that ended up catching a 5-pounder, and he brought it to the surface, and it literally just laid on its side in the water still, just dead. Like, he brought it in the boat, and it was dead. Like, it just came up. Like, it was just one of those crazy deals, especially because it proves how sensitive smallmouth can be. But it's crazy how deep you can catch them and how much you have to fizz, and it adds the strategic sense into one strategic, but also an added sense of conservation when you come up to these fisheries this time of year. I mean, I've seen it and I've done it where you've caught fish out of 70 foot of water and they're on the bottom. I mean, these fish are coming up from super deep, and I think, it's really important. I think it's really awesome what you guys do with obviously the new anglers, because there's guys that have talked about it on stage at Champlain that, they're going to St. Lawrence, maybe from the south. They've never been up this way. They don't know, they've never seen a fishery like this, where it can be kind of stressful for guys like that haven't been up there and kind of done that sort of deal. But it's cool what you guys do from an educational piece, and I think your guys' added highlight to it is really important.
Well, that's this is a very special fishery, and
right.
It's got some issues. Some of the research that Ontario Ministry of Fisheries and New York DEC have done on the lake, on the river, and Lake Ontario. There's some things looming on the horizon. In terms of the quality of this fishery long term, it needs protecting, and that's
right.
we certainly want to try to emphasize that with our anglers, because with live coverage and the exposure that these guys are getting on FS1 now, on the Fox network, and certainly on our media other media platforms, what these pro anglers do, the rank and file anglers often emulate that. And if we can get all of our guys doing it right, and saying the right things, then we think that'll translate into better behavior and better practices all the way down through the angler ranks, down to the high school kids, all the way, where they're just learning about these fisheries and how to take care of them.
Right. So in line with fizzing, I think one thing you see a lot of guys doing, and you kind of see this kind of almost around the country, is ice and live wells.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that I've seen, and I actually have a friend up on the St. Lawrence. He's actually a smallmouth guide. You might either know him or have seen him around weigh-ins before, because he's been a camera boat. His name's Dean Meckes. This is a conversation that we've had in the past about ice, and he has a cool little system that I'll get into here in a second. But what is your opinion on, and I've heard this a bunch, of not putting too much ice in too fast because you can shock the fish? Is that correct? Is that incorrect? Is it kind of a middle ground? I'm curious your thoughts.
It's kind of. The answer is maybe. If you put a lot of ice in, or put the fish into water that is significantly colder than where they came from, and by that I'm talking about anything that's 10 or 20 degrees difference.
Okay.
Yeah, it does cause them some thermal shock, but they will acclimate to that. The problem comes when you go back the other way. If they've been in a live well that was 15 or 20 degrees colder, and then they go back into the waiting line tanks at our weigh-in, the live release boat, and ultimately back into the river that is warmer, that's what screws them up.
Mm-hmm.
Bass can handle going from warm to cold. They just get lethargic. Their systems just, they're cold-blooded. They just throttle down. What they can't handle is going the other direction, going from cold to hot or warmer water very quickly. They're physiologically, things just get screwed up, and that can kill them. So that's why we have always recommended moderate amounts of ice, 5 to 7 degrees difference between your live well and what the lake temperatures are. And when I say lake temperatures, I'm thinking first thing in the morning, before we have any kind of heating in the afternoon, just from, bright sunny weather. But whatever it is, early in the morning, that 5 to 7 degrees. So, when somebody, and I've seen these YouTube videos and they just drive me crazy, where some guy dumps a 20-pound bag of ice in his live well and fills the thing up with water and has no idea what the temperature is in that live well. Yeah, when you put those fish in there, they're gonna shrink up and they're gonna get really calm. And chances are those fish are gonna be alive when they get to weigh in. But at some point in that weigh-in process, they're gonna have to go back into that warm water. He's gonna drive home and never know what happens to those fish, but chances are they're gonna die. And that's one of the problems with social media these days. There is so much misinformation out there,
right,
that needs to be corrected, and there's almost no time and not enough people to be able to provide the right information. When somebody posts something or puts a video up that's just wrong,
right,
we've got to have people that are willing to step up and say, "Hey, dude, that's not right. You don't, it might have saved you from getting a dead fish penalty, but it's not really doing those fish any favors."
Right.
And that's the kind of thing that there's just so much of it out there that it's really becoming a challenge, and that's how anglers are learning these days, is from the internet. You take the high school and the college anglers, that's all they know. They haven't learned from experience yet because they haven't had a chance to have much experience. They're learning from YouTube,
right,
and podcasts and Instagram, and in the high school case, they're learning from their boat captains.
Oh, that's a good point.
Who may not know what really needs to be done.
All right. That's why we bring on the best. That's why you're on here, Gene.
With high school tournaments, we're finding all over the country that the boat captains, a lot of them are not experienced anglers. They're just dads or uncles or grandpas or somebody that has a boat.
Papa.
and you put the two kids in there with them, and those kids are going to learn from that boat captain,
right,
and from social media.
Now,
and
this might be like a convoluted question when it comes back to the ice, but you're saying maybe you put like 5 to 7 pieces of ice in the water. What if somebody were to freeze water in, like, let's say a water bottle, and put that in there so that disperses? Is that a good idea for anglers as well?
That's the idea is drop the temperature 5 to 7 degrees as an example. And that's something that everybody needs to learn what works for their boat. Okay.
That's a great point.
I've got a 1996 Champion. Okay.
One of the best boats ever made.
Got a great freshwater boat. Anyway, got a 30-gallon live well. I can put an 8-pound block of ice, which is really just 1 gallon of water when you think about it. An 8-pound block of ice, or 2 half-gallon milk jugs, that are frozen, in my live well, and it will cool the water in that particular size live well about 7 or 8 degrees for about 3 hours or so. So over the course of let's say an 8-hour tournament day, I'm going to have to carry some extra ice somewhere in the boat because my milk jugs are going to melt, and I'm going to need to maintain that temperature in the live well. I'm going to have to add some more ice later on down the road. I kind of like the idea of freezing it in a container or using block ice because it does melt more slowly. When you put crushed ice in a live well, it changes the temperature almost instantly. And if the fish are already in there, then you have a little more chance of shocking them compared to frozen in a container of some sort, a 2-liter pop bottle or something like that.
The displacement of the coolness from the water bottle takes a little longer to take effect, so it doesn't warm as quick.
Yeah, and so it gives you a more continuous cooling instead of all at once.
Yeah.
So it lasts a little bit longer. The other thing that a lot of people are concerned with when you're talking about using ice is chlorine. If you're using just crushed ice out of a bag, if you're really concerned, just leave it in the bag or freeze water in a bottle or a milk jug. But what we've seen is, as I said just a minute ago, 8-pound block of ice, that's 1 gallon of water in a 30-gallon live well. The dilution factor is so great that whatever chlorine there might be in that ice doesn't make any difference. In fact, in our weigh-in tanks and stuff we set up backstage for our weigh-ins for BASS events, sometimes we'll put, depending on the temperature, we might put 50, 60 pounds of ice, but it's 120 gallons of water in those tanks. So 5 or 6 gallons of water frozen, in 120. Same thing on our release boats. We ice those routinely. Even on somewhere like the St. Lawrence River, where the water temperatures might be 72 degrees or so, we're still going to try to knock it down about 5 degrees. Now, when we get to some place where the water temperatures are low 70s and below, we may not need to add any ice. It's when you start getting up into the 70s and above where things really start to get critical. And especially when you get 78, 80, now up here, they're probably not going to see that kind of temperatures.
Right.
But certainly in inland lakes and southern reservoirs, we routinely see surface temperatures 80, 85 degrees. But maintaining some kind of a constant temperature slightly below the lake or river level when you're, say, at 70 or above is good practice.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you mentioned the frozen gallons, because that's exactly where I was leading to when I mentioned earlier my friend Dean Meckes. He's actually, for that tournament I told you I was in as a co-angler, he's who I drew as a pro, and it was actually the first time I got to meet Dean. And the night before, when we spoke on the phone saying, hey, what should I be prepared for, all the spiel that a co-angler and a pro kind of have the night before a tournament. And I asked him, like, hey, do you want me to go grab ice for us in the morning? He said, hey, don't worry about it. Like, I have my own process. So I didn't really think much of it. I was like, okay. And because it was my first tournament actually ever on St. Lawrence. I'd been on it, but I've never had to put fish in a live well on St. Lawrence. And I get there, he shows me as we start catching them. And Dean he's a stick. He's a guy up there. But he showed me he had frozen sherbet containers. So it's basically, it looked like the discs that they use in oh gosh, what's the sport where they roll the disc down, they sweep?
Is it curling?
Curling. They look like curling discs, essentially what they look like in the sherbet containers. And that's what he put in. And that's where I learned exactly what you just described, of using a bigger container so that it slows the rate that water cools. That's where I learned that. And it was really eye-opening to me. And I've been trying to, I really would like to get Dean on here to talk about this as well, being that he's from the North Country. But it's a concept that's really awesome and super easy to do if you can obviously keep that ice cold for the duration of the tournament day. But that was going to be my question, was what you thought of the process. And I'm so glad you mentioned the gallons, because it's a cool concept and it's an easy switch that many might not think. They might just dump a whole bag of ice in there and could be completely different than that process.
When I was back in the mid 90s, when we were doing our bass tournament research, there have been a lot of research done across the country on bass mortality related to tournaments. And every one of the researchers had some kind of recommendation about, you should do this, you should do that. Well, in the mid-90s, we decided to test those recommendations, and that's where we went through the process and worked with a number of different tournament organizations where we'd split the anglers up into different groups, and each group got to do something different. Some of them used ice, some of them didn't. Some of them put salt in their live wells, some of them didn't. A lot of different treatments. And then we were able to look at the results at the end of the year from, a half a dozen or more different tournaments to see what really made a difference in terms of reducing delayed mortality. Not the number of fish that die in the live well and come in, some guy gets a dead fish penalty, but the ones that die 2 or 3 or 7 days later. And that's where we came up with what we call the Keeping Bass Alive protocols. KBA for short. Keeping Bass Alive is the guidebook that we put together in 2003 that has all of the protocols on the ice, salt, the recirculating, fresh water, when you need to change it, how much, what kind of temperatures you need to look at. Those have been the guidelines since 2003, and we really haven't changed much in since then. There have been some other studies that have validated those processes. In fact, one just 2 or 3 years ago, where a professor went ahead and tested those things, and it works. We know it works, and it can make a difference in terms of keeping fish healthy, so that they survive the ordeal of going through the tournament experience, being caught and handled, put in the live well and hauled around all day, and going through the weigh-in. There's periods of the weigh-in where they're out of the water. Those fish are holding their breath. We certainly try to minimize that as much as we can. But our whole protocol for what the anglers need to do and what we do at weigh-ins is all part of that big package that we call Keeping Bass Alive.
Right. Okay. So a direction I want to go here, and it's one that I have personal feelings about, but I don't want to do anything about yet because I don't know all the information. It's another reason I really love having you on here, is because I feel like you'll have the answers for me, or at least a direction in which I could get the answers. And it's being that I live in the heart of the Finger Lakes down here in Rochester. And one of the biggest things that pisses a lot of us anglers off from the area, and it may just be, I could be completely in the wrong here, and I'm okay, and I'm prepared to accept that. But one thing that we see and we don't like, and we point the finger at for a lot of either a fish kill or destroying of grass, is spraying grass. And I'm very curious to hear your insights and your thoughts behind spraying grass, if it's actually killing the fish, what it does to the fishery, if it might be important to the fishery, for one, as well, and if us anglers are just should get over it because it's good for the fishery. Or I'm kind of going on a tangent here, but I'm just kind of curious your thoughts behind the spraying the grass.
I know where you're going.
Yeah.
And real quick, can I add one little more note onto that? And if it is affecting it, what would be the perfect plan for a fisheries management and like recreational boaters and homeowners to sit down and come together? What would be the perfect plan to help create the most perfect healthy boating and recreational environment, but also a bass fishery environment for the bass fishermen? So kind of like a two-part question there for you.
Well, you answered the question.
Huh.
You have to get people together at the table. And in most situations where aquatic plant management is an issue, it's an issue for a number of different stakeholders, whether it's homeowners, whether it's power companies, lake associations, water skiers, recreational boating, and fishing. To do it right, the powers that be need to bring all of those people together and everybody sit around the table and hash it out. It's never easy because everybody thinks they're right and they should have some more consideration given to their side of the argument. And that makes those kind of decisions and those discussions, sometimes they can be rather heated. Hopefully, if it's done right, you've got somebody that is there as a mediator, facilitator that can help guide the discussion so that everybody gets their say and everybody gets a chance to be a part of building the solution. This is not unique to New York. It's something we deal with in
all over.
Let's see, let me think. Right now, Florida, Texas, Louisiana, Maryland, Connecticut, Minnesota. I can just keep going on.
Yeah.
It's probably all 48 continental states, I'm assuming,
It's
that
pretty
have.
close. But you probably could throw Hawaii in there too. They do have bass there, but it's a problem in a lot of places. Now, in a lot of places where you have man-made reservoirs, almost none of them were built for fishing. Fishing and recreation are a byproduct of flood control or hydropower or water supply or something like that. And so that kind of changes the argument sometimes a little bit. Natural lakes, like you're talking about, Bailey, and the Finger Lakes, or most of the places in northern states where you have natural lakes, when invasive species get in, hydrilla, milfoil, curly-leaf pondweed, starry stonewort is the new really bad one that people are worried about. Some of those places are such good ecosystems for growing plants that those invasives just take off and can outcompete everything else. And then at some point, the abundance of those plants gets to being a problem, whether it's clogging up water intakes, covering up swim beaches. It's growing around people's docks to a point where they can't get their boats in and out of the boat slips.
Right.
And so the water managers, whoever's responsible for that water, a lot of times their first reaction is, we've got to nuke this stuff and get rid of it before we have to deal with that explosive growth that causes us real problems, because then it gets really expensive.
Right.
It's a lot cheaper to deal with it when it's a little problem than after it's gone crazy on them.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times the approach then is, attack the stuff. That's at that point, that's where, going back to this idea of having a task force or a group think, where everybody can get together and create that plan. Even in those early stages, that's a really important part, because you want to make sure that the fisheries voices are heard in terms of, where are we going with this? How much of this stuff, a lot of times once these invasives get in, you never completely eradicate them.
Right.
And And so at some point you kind of have to say, okay, how much of this stuff can we live with? Or what are we going to have to do to maintain some minimum amount? And on the other side of that is we don't usually want to wreck the native aquatic plants that have been in those systems for eons.
Yep.
Because there is a lot of evidence that shows that healthy fisheries do better when there is a certain level of abundance of aquatic plants. Now, exactly what that percentage is, is it 20% of the lake or 50% of the lake? That's going to vary a lot. But
Right.
Ideally, the strategy would be to try to control the invasives, maintain some minimum amount there without doing a lot of damage to the native aquatic plant community.
Yeah.
That's where,
that's the struggle.
Again, that getting that group together and, making sure that people are held to task, that there's some accountability built into the system.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times communities, they don't have their own weed control people. They got to hire contractors.
Right.
So there's got to be some way of making sure that those contractors are doing A, what they're supposed to be doing, B, that they're doing everything legally, that there's not anything going on, that's outside of what they're tasked to do.
Right.
And that just kind of all goes back to that, having that group meeting to begin with and getting
Mm-hmm.
everybody together. And if the authorities who are in charge of that body of water are smart enough to really think about it, they want to get everybody together because they don't want this continuous battle, because
Right.
from an administrative standpoint, it's a headache to have, people yelling at you from one side or the other. Every other week, it's the other guys,
Mm-hmm.
that are on your case.
It's a blame game.
Yeah.
This is your fault.
So get everybody together. I'll give you an example. Florida has had horrendous aquatic plant problems for decades. And the whole idea now of using less herbicides, using more mechanical treatments to try to remove aquatic plants, things like that are starting to gain some traction. Down there, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission is who's responsible for doing the actual weed control. And so they brought together a group called a Technical Advisory Group, a TAG, that has about 30 people on it. And they invited homeowners association folks, marina operators. They've got the bass fishing organizations involved. They've got the canoeing and kayaking groups. They've got somebody on this tag from all sorts of different organizations and some government agencies that are involved with using that water for irrigation or flood control or whatever. So they've got all of these people, and they have, now we're going into the second year of having meetings. Of course, COVID kind of screwed all that up in terms of having
of course, naturally,
in-person meetings, but we had Zoom meetings, which that's a whole nother issue. But we had these meetings where everybody gets to talk about the problems, and everybody is trying to help be part of a solution.
Right.
And so, come to some sort of consensus opinion where, yeah, we can live with a little of that as long as you'll give us a little of this. And that's
a healthy foundation.
That's the only way it can work. And I'll tell you, the best place that's ever worked in the history of weed control is Gunnersville Reservoir in Alabama. One of my predecessors, Bruce Shupp, who was the conservation director at Bass, got so tired of listening to bass fishermen complain about the weed spraying at Gunnersville. And then the vegetation, TVA actually owns Gunnersville. But we called it the weed wars because it got nasty for a long time. And Bruce was able to convince TVA to put together one of these groups, and the city of Gunnersville, and they got all of these groups together. And that organization came up with a long-term plan of how to manage the hydrilla and the milfoil and now the eelgrass and whatever. Of course, there they've got navigation to deal with, up and down the Tennessee River. I mean, there's a lot of different stakeholders that were involved. And that group has now been functioning for 20 years.
Wow.
It's phenomenal.
That's awesome.
I mean, the vegetation kind of comes and goes, and different things will grow. Some years the hydrilla comes up, and next year the eelgrass comes and the hydrilla goes away. And of course, then they have a flood or two, and
and there's no grass at all.
Yeah, it's a very dynamic system. But that group is held together, and they have these long-term plans about, here's where we want to go with this, and everybody agrees. Everybody is bought into it, and
right.
That's the key to any of these kind of problems.
Yeah, that's what we need here, Andrew.
We call it, you got to have a seat at the table.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's what we're lacking here in New York. And I circle it back to what you mentioned earlier, Gene. It's education. I know you're full familiar with in New York with the DEC. They have I actually don't know their specific position, but essentially they're these workers who I think the majority of them are fishery interns that are supposed to check for invasive species, and I'm all for preventing invasive species, but it circles back to education because and there's some guys around here that are they're advocates of just not allowing them to see your boat, don't talk to them, that sort of thing, and kind of like what we talked about, getting able to sit down and talk about this is huge. So I don't think ignoring that complete thing is the right situation. But I don't fault anyone for not talking. But at the same point in time, I've gone out of my way one day to one of our lakes to retrieve hydrilla, which is what they were trying to attack and spray. And I've gone out at the same day, I've gotten hydrilla, and I got a strand of milfoil. And afterwards, when they were looking, at my kayak and deal when I got off the water, I asked them, I held them out my hands, and I said, which one's hydrilla and which one's milfoil? And I did this a few times, and each time they've all gotten it wrong. They've chosen that hydrilla was milfoil and gotten them mixed up. And those are the people reporting back to so-and-so. I don't even know the hierarchy of that, of what's supposed to be being sprayed, where's it being reported to. And I think that's where it starts, and that's where the problem lies, is misidentification for one, but education needs to be crucial. And that's where you mentioned sitting down with all parties involved and having the conversation, one, talking about solutions, but also educating, I think would be absolutely crucial and save a lot of the headache, really. I mean, for everyone involved.
Right. And that's, you're exactly right. And that has to be brought up to the higher ups.
Mm-hmm.
Those kind of issues have to keep being pushed up the chain of command so that the powers that be understand that we've got some problems here.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a very fixable problem. It's, in that case, if they're getting out, I mean, think about the guys that are actually doing the spraying.
Right.
If they don't know what kind of plant they're supposed to be looking for, or if somebody else has identified, well, here's the area where you're supposed to spray, and they've misidentified the vegetation. The guy that's doing the spraying, he's just doing his job.
Yeah.
Okay, he goes out and he sprays in that area. He's done his job. Now, the fact that it may be the wrong plants, somebody else somewhere hasn't done their job.
Oops.
And that's where, calling that sort of thing to the attention of the people up the food chain is really important.
Right.
So Bailey, the last time I was out practicing for this tournament I have coming up this weekend, I was talking to one of the boat attendants at that said lake that just has grass everywhere, right? She actually was the first one that I've had identify weeds properly from the Eurasian milfoil and just standard milfoil that's natural to New York State. She goes, I was talking to her for like 15 minutes. She goes, New York State is actually in the process of training water weasels on how to identify different types of vegetation from the moment they're born to stop spraying grass in New York. They're actually working on a plan, she told me, to grow like otters and weasels and minks to eat grass. Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
That's some high-tech stuff.
I was like, if that comes to fruition, that'd be kind of cool. But I guess, Gene, I'd want to know your stance on that. Do you think like something that could work?
That seems weird.
Training these critters to eat vegetation? Or
yeah. Like to identify and eat Eurasian milfoil from because they know what they are.
To begin with, I'm pretty sure that otters and minks and weasels are carnivores, not.
I thought so too.
So I looked it up here. There is a type of mink in fresh water in New York State that does eat vegetation.
Okay.
From looking this up, but I'm like, it's semi-aquatic. They eat weeds and are carnivorous. So I'm like, oh, that's weird.
But are we really going to rely on water weasels to clear out all the invasive grass in a 40-mile-long lake?
They're thinking outside the box,
Yeah. But that's what she told me. I was like, this doesn't make sense.
You should just re-engineer grass carp.
A lot of those things are that outside the box thinking. There's a lot of that going on in a lot of places right now because the use of chemical herbicides is getting a lot of negative publicity, and a lot of people are pushing back against the use of herbicides, and so the agencies that are tasked with controlling invasive plants are having to start thinking about what are some alternatives, what other ideas have we got now. In some places it is grass carp. Some places they're doing a lot more. They're trying to do more mechanical harvesting, although that the costs and the side effects, special things like mechanical harvesting can create a lot of other issues. And it depends on the kind of plants you're dealing with. There's a lot of places where properly used, properly applied aquatic herbicides are very safe and can be very effective in controlling. And in some places, they're the only thing that really has a chance of controlling nuisance vegetation.
Right.
So, and then that kind of, Bailey, back to your original idea about the bass fishermen getting all pissed off about things. At some point, that's where we need to educate the anglers to the fact that you don't have to have every sprig of vegetation in that lake for that lake to be healthy.
Right.
There's a balance somewhere, and there is a possibility that eliminating or reducing, maybe not eradicating, but reducing some aquatic vegetation, especially if it's potentially this invasive stuff that creates problems, is not always a bad thing. You think about certain species like the starry stonewort that I mentioned earlier. I think there is some probably in New York. It's getting really to be a nuisance in Michigan, Wisconsin. I think it's in Minnesota now. Fishermen hate this stuff. It's not like all fishermen think all grass is good. That's not true.
Yeah.
There's some plants that that are just bad, and they're not good for the lake. They're not good for fishing. So,
yeah,
that's an educational process.
Yeah, no, on that point, I agree. It's when you start spraying these native species of grass is when it kind of starts to really annoy a lot of people. But kind of going back to the point real quick of talking about ways, from a mechanical removal process. I mean, I don't want to speak for everybody here, but at least the folks that I know from the state. I mean, if you're in state in New York, I think the annual license is like $35. I am entirely willing to spend, twice the amount of money for for my license each year if I know that money's going to go towards conservation to pay for a mechanical removal, because one, I think just getting rid of a use of chemicals in the first place helps out not only just fishermen and the wildlife, but I don't feel like you really want to swim, even for boaters and homeowners. Do you really want to swim or have that be in the water? I feel like there's got to be some sort of chemical bodily harm if you're swimming in an area where it's been sprayed. I mean, I could be entirely wrong in that. It could be safe for humans, but I just feel like in general, I am fully willing to pay, if that's where the money's going to come from. I'm just kind of spitballing ideas, but to pay more for license fees if that means it could afford a mechanical removal. And I can speak for a lot of people. I know Andrew would agree here too, is he'd be willing to spend more on licenses if we know that money goes back to conservation in that fact, if that makes any sense. I might just sound like an idiot here, but
No, you're on track, but let me back up just a couple of notches.
Okay.
Aquatic herbicides, as I said before, if they are applied properly, in the right places, in the right amounts, are safe. There are very few chemicals that have to go through the kind of testing that aquatic herbicides have to go through. If they're used properly, they come in, they do their job, and they disintegrate. The sun breaks them down into compounds that are not harmful to people. Sometimes there'll be some water restrictions for a short period of time, but generally, most of the aquatic herbicides that are registered with EPA have had to go through ridiculously expensive testing to prove that they are safe for use in aquatic environments, because so many of these aquatic environments are people's drinking water.
Right.
And to be safe for drinking water, they've had to go through a lot more testing than what Fred the farmer sprays on his corn crop out there, because they're used in aquatic environments. So that's one of the first things. A lot of people assume that, we're putting poisons in our lakes. Well, it's poison to the plants. That's the whole idea. You're trying to kill the plants. But if they're used properly in the right dosages and those sort of things, and they're applied in the right manner, they're not hurting things.
That's good to know. Something I did not know.
To your license question, you guys are avid anglers.
Correct.
As am I. I've got a lifetime license that I bought a long time ago from the state of Oklahoma because I thought it was worth it. It was a lot of money at the time. I buy a license to every state that we go to if I get a chance to fish. And I usually buy an annual license. I don't buy a little 1 or 2 day license. I think it's worth it. I don't know how many licenses they sell in New York in a year, fishing licenses. I'm guessing it's probably 500,000 or something. the number of people that are really avid anglers like you two guys is a very small percentage. So when the state comes along and says, hey, we need to raise the price of the license from $35 to $45. To you guys, that's not a big increase. To 90% of those other people that buy a license, they're going to say, oh, heck no. We don't, no. And in fact, a huge percentage of those people will drop out and not even buy a license. Almost every state runs into that when they try to raise a license. Excuse me, it may be no more than the cost of a 6-pack of beer. But the number of people buying those licenses go down.
That's a good point.
Because the vast majority of those people are not, they just don't see the value in it. So here's where we get into that group advisory committee we was talking about earlier. Excuse me. If one of those groups thinks they are being affected more than all the rest of them, then maybe they should be paying a little bit more towards the control of the aquatic plants. If the homeowners group wants control done around docks and shorelines and places like that, then maybe they should be tasked with paying the bill for that additional control.
A control tax, right, is what a popular term we could use.
Yeah. So, in some places, some states where they allow the homeowners to spray around their private docks. Can't spray the whole lake, but they'll allow them to spray within a certain perimeter around their docks. But the homeowner's got to pay the bill. Of course, a lot of times when they find out how expensive those herbicides are, they decide, well, I can live with some of these weeds because that stuff's pretty expensive.
That's an interesting point.
Rather than the state or county or government taking on the responsibility of having to pay for all of that, perhaps the groups that are being affected, power companies, if there's a problem with weeds getting sucked into their water intakes and clogging things up and stuff like that, then the power system probably needs to be tagged a little more for paying for some of the bill. So it's not like you tax everybody, because not everybody's going to benefit from it. Mm-hmm. But that's the kind of thing that advisory group has to hash out.
Right. That's a really good point. I'm glad you mentioned that. Andrew, is there anything else you have for Gene before we hit him with our last question?
Well, I guess the one thing I do want to touch on real fast is the plan that was implemented at the Bassmaster Classic and why it was so successful. I think that was a huge conservation point that was slightly overlooked from the Classic. I know it was touched on a little bit, but with the hot temperatures, the long drive, the mortality rate was at an extremely low rate from what I read. And I know you had a part of that, if I'm not mistaken, correct? Again, implementing that plan with the Texas Fishery Commission.
I saw a lot of oxygen tanks and boats. Yeah.
Well, as soon as the Classic was rescheduled from March to June, I started sweating bullets. It was.
Oh, I'm sure.
we haven't had a summertime Classic since 2008, and so we knew right off the bat that we were going to have a lot more challenges in dealing with the fish care issues. So immediately we got with Texas Parks and Wildlife and started putting together a plan to help minimize the mortality of fish that were going to be hauled from Lake Ray Roberts to Fort Worth, which is, it's about 53 miles or something like that, but it's an hour and a half drive with the traffic.
Mm-hmm.
And it was 95 degrees. Although we kind of hit a few lucky things. The lake had gotten a lot of rain. The lake was high. The water temperatures were a little cooler than normal for a North Texas summer. I grew up about 20 miles from Lake Ray Roberts, so I'm very familiar with that lake. I fished it before it was legal to fish on it. But
love it. You rebel.
But we went to Parks and Wildlife right off the bat, and you know, they made a proposal, and we kind of made counter proposals, and we kind of we worked out a deal that we thought, okay, what can we collectively do?
I'd say there's a common trend here. Sit down at the table.
Yeah, and it worked. We had a whole bunch of conference calls, and you know, the plan ultimately was to go ahead and weigh the fish at the lake the first 2 days, and simply allow the anglers to bring in 2 fish to show in the arena. That way, all the rest of the fish that were caught those first 2 days were immediately loaded onto our live release boat, taken out into the lake, and turned loose. Texas Parks and Wildlife then hauled the fish that did come into the arena. They hauled them back to the lake in one of their big hatchery trucks, and then we helped them release those fish that in the evening after the weigh-ins. The third day, we went ahead and had our traditional 5 fish come into the arena process, where they were actually weighed on the scales at the arena. And we actually used the exact same scales at the lake that we did in the arena. So every fish was weighed on the same scales over the course of 3 days. And we felt that helped maintain the integrity of the Classic. All the fish weighed on the same scales instead of on 53 little scales out there and floating around with a judge under each one of them. We didn't like that idea. Not when the crown jewel of bass fishing is on the line. And it still allowed us to bring some fish in for the fans that attended in Dickey's Arena, and it maintained certainly that last day the drama and the suspense of who's going to win the Classic. Even with Bass Track and everybody thinking they know who won what and how the scores went, you never know until those fish hit the scales. And I mean, we saw that at Champlain last week. That are, you know, in case of a matter of ounces can make the difference. Yeah. But what that plan did is Parks and Wildlife agreed to it. We agreed to it. Everybody thought it was work. It reduced the number of fish that were hauled from the lake into Fort Worth to the arena by about 50%. So over the course of the 3 days, we weren't moving near as many fish. And consequently, with the cooler water temperatures, our anglers did a great job. Parks and Wildlife guys, when the boats would come in to the arena, Parks and Wildlife crews were checking water temperatures, and they had oxygen bottles, and they'd put an air stone in each live well just to kind of give those fish a little shot of oxygen. But they were amazed at how good the fish looked and how healthy they were. We were checking the fish at the lake because the 2 fish that were brought in each day, or the 5 fish on the third day, still had to make that 90-minute run into town. So we had crews at the lake putting ice in the live wells, checking the water quality, making sure the aerators were all, you know, recirculating full time. And those guys out there were really surprised, pleasantly surprised at how when the anglers came in, their fish were in good shape. And that like I said earlier, the anglers got to do their job for that 4, 5, 6, 8 hours a day. The weigh-in can only fix so much.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
They did a great job in the boats, and with the help of Texas Parks and Wildlife, and I had a crew of about 8 Bass Nation Conservation Directors that had volunteered their time and travel to come to Fort Worth to help with that fish care process. We made it work, and we had a 98.4% release rate over the course of the 3 days.
It's awesome.
Yeah. Well, kudos
So
to you.
we were very, 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 very pleased with how that all worked out.
Yeah. Heck yeah. Andy, anything else to add on that?
No, I just wanted to kind of congratulate and touch on that fact for a hot Texas, because the heat was starting to ramp up during that tournament. Obviously, the water temps weren't quite there.
Brutal.
So I'd be mostly worried about those fish transporting from the lake to the arena, because they're not able to pump in fresh water the entire time.
Right.
So that's the most dangerous part of the entire day. But
that was the idea, icing the live wells and stuff before they left the lake.
Mm-hmm.
And our biggest fear, I'll tell you, was traffic. Fort Worth, for no bigger, Fort Worth's about 400,000 people or so, I guess but it's part of that Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, and the traffic there is really bad. It's horrible.
It's sucked.
and that was our biggest fear was that we were going to have a boat get stuck somewhere in a traffic jam, or 2 or 3 boats. And not only, of course, the TV people, they were just horrified over the idea of, what's that going to do to the weigh-in schedule and all that. And of course, from my perspective, we're worried about the fish.
Who cares about the weigh-in? Let's protect the fish.
But luckily, it all worked out. Everything worked like it was supposed to.
Perfect.
I love it when a plan comes together.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
A team, yeah. Well, Gene, first and foremost, want to say thank you for obviously taking time out of your night. I know it's not a down week for you. It is grind time for the last tournament of the year. Well, last elite tournament, excuse me, because I know you obviously continue into the rest of 2021. And huge props to you and what you do, and appreciate you taking time to come on and talk with us and educate not only us, but all our viewers and listeners. So we greatly appreciate it.
You're more than welcome, and if we can do it again in the future, I'd be glad to come on.
Yeah, we would love to have you. Obviously, I told you about 45 minutes to an hour. We're already going almost an hour and a half. So I apologize on almost doubling what I told you time-wise. But no, we would love to have you back on the show. I think it will be really cool if you get some down the road, we get some Monday nights where you're free. And we do our Monday Night Live show where we can take not only questions from Andrew and I, but also questions from viewers who might have things they thought about that Andrew and I haven't thought about. So I think that would be really cool to get you on there. And obviously, we'll be in touch. Hopefully, I'll see you at ICAST next week. And obviously, looking forward to tuning into Bass Live tomorrow morning.
All right. Sounds like a plan. Appreciate it.
Sir. Of course. Well, folks, that's going to do it for tonight's show. I think Andy and I are going to wrap it up here. And we appreciate everybody tuning in. See you guys next week.